Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Good Morning Soul. And this is going to be part 3 in our Collecting Days little series. And I assume you have watched the previous episodes at this point, but if you haven't, I'm basically retelling my time of being a collector. I used to collect a bunch of movies, a bunch of video games. I was basically hoarding stuff. And this is gonna be the fun one because if you know anything about collecting, you know how much of a bitch it is to display all of your collection. So I at the time was really into, just buying like a big shelf and putting everything on that. And I would have all my movies in alphabetical order, or if depending on what time period I'm talking about, sometimes I would have it by genre, sometimes I would have it by like my favorite movies up here and my least favorite ones down here. That was just fun to me to organize the movies like that. But I would buy these big shelves, or we would have them lying around the house, and I would use them for this. And the thing you have to know of why this was such a struggle is because I used to move a lot as a kid. I don't move as much anymore, but during that time period, like my middle school era, and even throughout high school, I moved a lot. I remember we only lived in like 2 houses in my original town, and then once we moved across country, like the town I'm living in now, I think we lived in like 5 or 6 houses, probably more than that actually. It's probably more like 7, roughly. Not counting the time we moved back to Minnesota and then back down to North Carolina. But via all those houses, I was packing up my collection a lot. It was basically like every 6 months to a year, pack it all up, put it back in the trailer, and we're off again. And God, it was such a struggle back then because moving these shelves around, these shelves would just break. They're made of wood, and we're taking them across country, we're taking them across town. And I was doing the majority of the work for most of these moves because my mom, she smoked cigarettes her entire life, and sometimes we'd live in an apartment that has a lot of stairs. Sometimes we would and she would be busy doing other things, and I'm just a kid with nothing to do, so I might as well like move our whole family's like luggage from house to house. And once I was able to drive, I remember at one point like most of our stuff was like in a storage unit. Like it was a storage unit that was like $100 plus a month, and I remember we were only supposed to be in there for like 1 to 2 months. And then somehow, like, all of our stuff was in there for, like, 6 months. And I remember a lot of my, like, stuff from my collection was in there. And if you watched the last episode, whenever my things weren't on a shelf being displayed, like, it, like, physically would nerve me. Like, I would just be thinking about it. Like, I'd just look at my movies and be like, oh, I wish the rest of them were here. Or I wish my books were here. Even if I didn't have a shelf, because they were breaking all the time. So I remember like once I had my license and my mom was okay with me driving the car by myself, I would just drive to that storage unit. I just got my stuff out of there, and then like I hated the idea of my mom wasting all this money on this storage unit. So like I remember going there and just moving couches and beds by myself into this little car that probably wouldn't fit that much. And eventually I think the couches and the beds were actually the last things. Those were like the things I like needed help, and some of it we just threw away. But like I remember a bunch of like other weird furniture, like small little coffee tables, little lamps, stuff like that. I would just fill the car up over and over again, and a lot of it was my collection. Like I had a lot of stuff that I don't have anymore. I had a lot of books. A lot of them I did read. A lot of these movies I watched. A lot of these are so sentimental to me. Like, you don't even understand. Like, having a shelf full of 200 movies might just feel like junk to you. But to me, it was like having a trophy case full of 200 memories. That's the way I looked at like my collection. And you know, I was doing reviews. I talked about my website in an episode. I don't know if you guys have seen that one yet as the time this goes up, but I was doing reviews. I just wanted to experience everything. I wanted to experience all the art. Like, my dream back then was to be a hermit and just be able to live in my little hoard safe space and to watch all these movies and everything. And part of me still, like, desperately wants that, but, like, I obviously, like, want to have, like, friends and family and all that stuff. So maybe that's, like, why I've, like, tried to do this YouTube thing, because that would be, like, the ideal career to, like, turn this art, like, experience process and to turn that into its own art form. I think this is, like, my origin story. Like, if you wanted to know why I do YouTube and why I think the way I do, like, this is it. This is, like, why this is why I do reviews for all these different things. Instead of just being a movie reviewer, I'm a game reviewer, because that's what I've always been, that guy, that jack of all, like, different things. And, you know, at first it was just movies and games, but then I got really into music, and then I got really into anime. And, you know, of course, once I got into anime, I had to buy a bunch of fucking anime. And, you know, I was always a reader, and even though I couldn't even read that fast, I would just have a bunch of books in my backlog, and eventually, you know, I couldn't even keep most of them. But yeah, that was basically what I was doing back then. And I remember at one point, my brother and I were sharing a room, and the room was, like, literally, like, obviously, I was gonna say smaller than the room I'm in right now, but it was basically the size of, like, a nice bathroom. And our beds were literally, like, touching, like, the ends of our beds were touching. There was a little TV, there was my shelf and a closet, and there was, like, no room to walk, like, at all. And it was, even back then, like, even though I just had this one shelf, and I remember we'd have, like, these little bins full of stuff, like, under the bed, and that's where I put, like, more of my collection. And I think this is, like, where I really learned, like, when we were living in this tiny little room, because basically my mom was dating a guy, and we moved into his house, and we got his little small room. That's where we were staying, and it was an awful time period. But I remember this is where I played a lot of Mass Effect 2 and a lot of Final Fantasy X. So I do have good memories there. But it was just awful being in that room. And it was really upsetting me just knowing that most of my stuff, like, wasn't going. That's probably why we had the storage unit, actually, because we couldn't put it all in this dude's house. That makes a lot more sense now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, it was not a fun time, and I just remember not being able to, you know, see my collection, and that would upset me. But I still was buying stuff. I was still, even though we had nowhere to live, my mom, you know, she obviously knew I was depressed at the time, so she would probably, like, try to make it up to me. We'd go to GameStop, we would go to these yard sales, and she'd just feed my addiction. And that was basically it. And God, like there was a lot of bad memories, but I try to remember only the good stuff. Like, in my mind, like, this was all gonna be worth it. Like, once I was able to become an adult and live in my own place, then I was finally gonna be able to put all these shelves out. I was gonna finally be able to live the life I wanted, which was to, like, every day wake up, pull something off of the shelf, talk about it, or do my review or whatever it is, and then that was it. That was, like, my dream, and it still kind of is. I just, obviously, that collector side of me, it might have died. I guess you'll have to keep watching to learn what happens, but yeah, that was my experience just with storage and the struggle that came with that. It was not a good time. But yeah, I think that's gonna be it for part 3. If you guys are still interested in the series, we have 2 more episodes to go. So, I'm gonna let you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? So with that, I leave you.